prison. Let's open our Bibles this morning to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1, as we continue this journal of Solomon's. You know, Solomon as the king was given by the Lord a greater wisdom than any man that had ever lived by God. And it came as a result of the Lord saying to Solomon, the new young king, what do you want from me? And he said, I want the wisdom to walk in my father's footsteps. I want to take care of your people like he did. And God was blessed. And he gave Solomon great wisdom. And Solomon did well early on. If you read the book of Proverbs, you'll read about Solomon's advice to his young son, about the ways of the Lord and the terrors that can trip you up in the world. But yet, as Solomon got older and as political alliances came towards him, he began in his middle years as a powerful king to go astray. He married lots of heathen women who brought their gods with them. And it wasn't long before Solomon's heart before God was turned. And it is during that turning away time that Solomon goes on this journey that is recorded in this journal, the book of Ecclesiastes. It means gathered things. It's from the Greek word church, those who have been called out or called out from the world to the Lord to gather together. But in this sense, it just means the things that Solomon has gathered as he goes into the world, but he wants to find life and hope and purpose, not in the God that he's known for so long, but in the world that he labels under the sun, life under the sun, the horizontal plane of life. Life that you can't find biblically without a faith in God and obedience to him. So Solomon takes this quest. He has the authority of being the king. He has wealth that, is at his disposal. He spends years traveling, if you will, looking, and we've spent months with him, listening to his observations, reading his conclusions, his frustrations, and his insights. But all of what we have looked at can be categorized under four main issues. And the issues are, there is a monotony of life without a purpose. There is an emptiness or a vanity or an end to human wisdom. You can't really get to there from here, apart from God. There is a tremendous futility in wealth and the hard work and concerted effort that it takes to get it in terms of any long-lasting rewards. And fourthly, he speaks often about the certainty of death. And those are the things that just kept kind of challenging him as he went. All of them he views from a worldly view that leaves Solomon crying out the word vanity a lot. There's nothing left. There's nothing left over. Now, in the last couple of chapters of this book, especially 10 and 11, as he goes to chapter 12 to make his conclusion, Solomon decides and looks at and is focused upon the comparison between the foolish man and the wise man. And you will find that happening a lot here in these two chapters, the comparison between the two. When the Bible, and especially Solomon as well, uses the term fool or folly or foolishness or just foolish, and it's used almost 200 times in the Bible, and most of them are Solomon's, it is always a reference to a spiritual condition where someone is devoid of God's direction. That's always the way that he uses the term. And the opposite of fool in the Bible is wise. The man who walks with God, the man who knows God, that listens to the Lord, that seeks after him, the man who lives a skillful life because he has heard what God has to say and lives accordingly. Thus the distinction. And Solomon spends a lot of time in this poetry book making comparison between the two. He does the same thing in the book of Proverbs. When the Bible speaks of a fool, it doesn't refer to someone with a low IQ or with less maybe formal education or somehow a mental deficiency. That's never a fool. It is one who is morally bankrupt and spiritually unavailable to the Lord or unwilling to listen. And so he lives with a short-term view of life rather than the long-term. He's an unbeliever. He's a fool. And Solomon, like I said, will make those comparisons for the next 3 or 4 weeks as we go through chapters 10 and 11. The wise believer who lives wisely in the Lord and the fool who does anything but. And he uses typical worldly examples to say, see what a fool is like? And we go, yeah, that's a fool. And to apply them spiritually to my life, well, that's exactly what we would be doing if we try to live apart from God. I heard someone once say it's not a wise thing to argue with a fool in public because someone walking by may not really be able to discern who is who. I heard of a fellow who was a pretty successful guy in Manhattan, and he got tired of the money and the pressure and the busyness of life, and he decided he would just slow down. So he sold everything he had. He went to Iowa and he bought a chicken farm. He's going to have the good life. And so he got the thing all fixed up and went out and bought 200 chicks. On the next day came home, they're all dead. So what in the world's going on here? So he bought 200 more, went out again, next day, got up, all dead. So wait a minute, this can't be right. I'm doing something wrong. And so he wrote to the Chicken Growers Association. He said, well, I'm really new at this, and I don't know what's going on, but in 2 days I've lost 400 chicks, and that seems like an awful lot in a short amount of time, so I want you to tell me, am I planting them too deep or too close together? The fellow at the Chicken Association wrote back and said, I really can't tell you until you send me a soil sample. Dumb, right? Fools. So, most of you have given your life to Jesus, and that's the way it should be. That makes you wise, not foolish. Because to go it alone, to try it without him, to somehow be able to look God in the face and say, you didn't need to send your son, I don't need him, is a foolish choice. And because you're saved, you live what Paul said to the Ephesians there in chapter 5, you live circumspect lives. In fact, he writes, see that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time. The days are evil. So don't be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. That's the same comparison Solomon will make. The word circumspect is one of the many Greek words for perfect, but it implies that you look in every direction to be sure you're not going to step in it, or step on it, or step in the wrong direction. You're going to watch where you're going and keep your eye on where you're headed. Certainly, all of us want to make good choices. Nobody likes to get ripped off. How much more in your life? So, by definition, the fool is one who doesn't know God, and the wise man is one who does. So, you and I aren't foolish anymore. We don't have to be. I think there's that Proverbs 22, verse 15 passage that says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child, but a rod of correction will drive it far from him. God has done that for us, hasn't he? And the fool is characterized, even in Psalms and in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, by many things. You remember that Psalm 14 passage that says, the fool says in his heart, there's no God. He denies God in practice, and so he lives as if God doesn't exist. Foolish. In Proverbs chapter 12, there are some words that say, the way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but the wise will heed counsel. People without God makes themselves the standard of right and wrong. They worship their own ways. In Proverbs chapter 14, Solomon will write, fools will mock at sin. They'll just devalue it. There's not sin. Come on, get with the times. They will eliminate conviction and justify everything. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. They don't have the fear of the Lord, so then they don't have wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction, I think the rest of that verse says. But you come to Jesus and you get saved and you become wise in the Lord. Paul was able to write in his last letter to Timothy and say to Timothy, I know that from a childhood you've known the Holy Scriptures, which has been able to make you wise through salvation and faith in Christ. I know that from a little kid you've learned to be wise. So we walk circumspectly. We are alert, if you will. God has given us wisdom, and the benefit you have is you have a Bible and you have God's Spirit living within you, and he will teach you the ways that you should go. You set this aside, and you're much like Solomon in Ecclesiastes. You have the wisdom of God available, and you won't use it. So this morning we want to look at the fools versus the wise. Our society places great premium on soft diplomacy. We are oftentimes willing to sacrifice truth for tact. The Bible doesn't do that. God pretty much, shoots straight and speaks bluntly to us about the way of life. Now, just to remind you, because it's poetry, and these books from Job through the Song of Solomon are in the poetic books. They're the books of wisdom in the Old Testament, but they're written almost always in Hebrew poetry, and you can even see the way that it's written in verses, right, rather than narrative. And there are the distinction of Hebrew poetry is that our poetry rhymes words, Roses are red, violets are blue. That's us. Hebrew poetry rhymes thoughts. So you can find oftentimes a line that makes a point and the next line makes the same point just with different words, and they call it synonymous parallelism, but it's just a tool of Hebrew poetry. Or sometimes you'll get one line that makes a statement and then you'll have a whole series of lines that follow to support that statement but saying different things about it. It's called synthetic parallelism. And sometimes you just have a line that is stated and the next line contrasts it, and it's called antithetical parallelism. Now, if you're not going to Bible school, don't write those things down. But just so that you have a feel for, poetry has a way of teaching us Hebrew poetry like that as well. We're going to see that this morning as Solomon takes the fool in the world to apply to the fool before the Lord, and then the wise as well. Verse 1. Dead flies putrefy a perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to the one who is respected for wisdom and honor. Perfumes in ancient times were derived usually from sap or bark or tree branches that, they were aloes or cinnamon or frankincense, and they were soaked in oil. And over time, that oil would become scented with the aloe or the tree that was planted in it. And then they were put on just to hide body odor from more than anything else. It was just to make you smell better in a very, deserted desert land. People didn't smell too good. And it was refreshing to have, you got some oil, that's good. We're glad you have that. In the process, though, of making this scented oil, the sweetness of the aloes in the oil would attract flies, and if you weren't careful and flies would get in, they would begin to decay and rot, and they would quickly kind of overpower the good smell that you were going after. You would now have this rotten smell. By proportion, there was much more scented oil than rotting flies. But that's where the lesson is here in these two verses. For it only takes a little to ruin a lot. Notice that Solomon says, dead flies can putrefy, can make to smell horrible a perfumer's ointment or oil. In like manner, so does. And he makes the application here at the end of the verse. You can spend your entire life building a reputation for yourself. You can be honorable and respectable and a man or a woman of character over many years, but all it takes is a few bad choices. A few bad decisions, some folly into your life, and it is often then the only thing that people will remember. Foolishness has tremendous destructive capability, so does not walking with God. You really want to just hurt yourself, put God's word aside, do it yourself, do it in your own manner. That's where hurt comes. Now you might say, well, gosh, the guy's been so faithful all of his life and he's had a couple of problems, that's not fair. And you'd be right. It's not fair, but it is what it is. The politician who is on the take, the pastor who runs off with a woman in the congregation, impossible to win them back to the place that they once were. No matter if they were sorry and I shouldn't have and I didn't mean it, it just takes one foolish move to destroy your reputation. When you hear of the words King David, who's the first person you think of? Why is that? He spent 40 years serving the Lord faithfully. It's because reputation is delicate and sin so destructive. So you think King David, you go Bathsheba. Right, it was horrible. Don't get me wrong. It placed him in great distress. But there were 40 other years where he did very well. Served the Lord with great conviction. So in one act, in 1 hour, at one time, an indulgence of sin can ruin your reputation. And look, we're all subject to temptation. We're all weak in some spot, some in some place, some in others. So what do you do as a wise person in the Lord? Well, you recognize your Achilles heel and you make provision to overcome it. Stay away from things that stumble you. Get away from things that can harm you. You know, Joseph was a young man who would certainly be responsive to the come-on of an older woman. But yet, walking with God and her persistence caused him one day to just run from the house. Sometimes the solution is just run. Better than staying. Joseph didn't stay and say to Potiphar's wife, let me share the 4 spiritual laws with you. He just ran. There was no time for talk. There was only time for escape. Sometimes you have to run from the magazine rack and run from the cable show and run from the internet and run from the donut shop. Run from the bar. Just run. Because it just takes a little bit, and your reputation as a Christian will have been undermined, and your effectiveness as a witness will be lost. How important we recognize the value of good reputation, and how few flies need to get in before that reputation is destroyed. A little foolishness can ruin a good work. Second of all, verse 2, much foolishness cannot be hidden. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. And when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he's a fool. By contrast to the foolishness in verse 1 of a believer, if you will, who allows a little folly to ruin his reputation, here in verse 2 it is the description of an unbeliever who makes us, through his life, abundantly clear that his heart is absolutely gripped by foolishness and he likes it. The inadvertent stumble in verse 1 that can leave a godly man without a witness turns now in verse 2 and 3 to the fool who has no interest at all in guarding his heart. Notice where his heart is, at his left. In other words, the right hand in the Bible is always that place of strength, that place that you look to for God's help. But this guy has no concern about his life, no focus. He's not on guard. My heart's at my left. Hey, I'm going to live how I want. I'm going to feel how I feel. I'm going to do what I do. The wise man controls his heart. It is at his right hand. I have set the Lord ever before me. He is at my right hand, and I shall not be moved. Same verse. You show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand, pleasure forevermore. So the wise man is interested in what God has to say. Even though he has places of stumbling, he is wise. He puts a guard up. He commits himself to learning. And God, I want to do things your way. Help me. And he commits himself to that discipline, if you will. But foolishness, much in the heart of a man, can't be hidden. And this guy certainly is no exception. The fool could care less. His heart needs no oversight, in his opinion. His life shows otherwise. We can all be foolish, but the wise seek the Lord to control and to make good choices. Solomon would say the fools are easy to spot, and they're slow to change. Even his life experiences, notice the words in verse 3, along the way. He never really has a heart to seek wisdom. All of God's warnings, all of God's callings are of little benefit because he closes his heart. He wants to play the fool. Ask him about God and he'll laugh it off. I don't need him. I make my own choices. I'm the captain of my own ship. Psalm 14 verse 1 has a counterpart, Psalm 53 verse 1. They both say the fool has said in his heart there's no God. But if you go back and look at those two passages, you'll see the words there is in italics. Because it literally reads in Hebrew, the fool has said no God. He might very well believe God exists, but he's made a determination he wants nothing to do with him. That's the fool. I don't need him. I don't need his help. Get that Bible away from me. Come into the 21st century. Wake up, man. Smell the coffee. This is the real world. And they just write God off. None for me, thank you. Look, we all are born sinners, and if you want to continue that way, then you're the fool. But if you come to Jesus and you're born again, the only thing you have to do is change your attitude from no God to yes, God. Help me. Thank you for helping me. So on one hand, there's a foolishness that can creep into a godly life and it can wreak havoc on another. There's just a fool's life that is evident in all that he says and does. His life is an open book. He doesn't care. He then turns, Solomon does, to speak about foolish rulers, foolish anger, and foolish responses. He mixes together the unbeliever with the believer, if you will. He says in verse 4, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, don't leave your post. For conciliation can pacify a great offense. And there's an evil I've seen under the sun, an error proceeding from the ruler, that folly or fools are set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I've seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. If ever a person needed wisdom, it's someone who's in charge of others. And Solomon knew that firsthand. He had the largest government agency of his day. And he needed the wisdom of God to fill the shoes of his father. But those under him must also be wise. And it is they who Solomon now addresses. Notice what he says in verse 4. He asks the wise to behave in a certain manner, even when the ruler is angry, and according to the verses that follow, is not very qualified to sit where he sits. He puts fools in charge. He promotes other fools. And then he gets angry at you without cause, the wise. When it comes to serving another, it is not wise for the wise to storm out in anger or make threats of leaving. It is wiser to seek conciliatory means to pacify those over us, for God will use that for good. You guys hearing a buzz? Paul, you hear that? We'll find it. You don't mind. You can go on without it, can't you? I can't. No, I'll be all right. So verse 4. Don't quit when the ruler gets upset. Could be the king, could be your boss, could be the baseball coach or ministry leader, anyone who is in over his head, who flies out off the cuff in rage. You just know they don't belong there. They've been put there by some fool. And they're being foolish, but they have power. It's unfair, it's undeserved. And your response is, I want to quit and walk away. I'll show you. I'm not coming back. See if you can make it without me. Sounds good. Foolish. Thank you, Rod. An angry response to anger is not a wise thing for the wise, even when the fool are in charge. And notice from verses 5, 6, and 7 that he uses a few verses to very poetically and poignantly illustrate the fact that oftentimes incompetent people are placed by fools as incompetent in places of power, and everyone under them suffers. Solomon had seen that a little bit, or would see that. You know, Solomon had experienced how incompetent people could be put in places of authority, and once they're there, they promote other friends of theirs who are also incompetent, and the whole thing's just a mess. And so what happens? The most qualified become the slaves. The most competent become those who walk while the fool rides on the horse. You've seen that before, I'm sure, maybe in your own job, and lamented over it. The incompetent treated like royalty. Interestingly enough, when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam comes to the throne, and he's that fool. The older folks say, you know, your dad really overtaxed the people just to build and build. You want to do them some good. You want to win the people to you. Pick up the burden of the taxation a little. And Rehoboam said, you guys are a bunch of old men. I'm not listening to you. And he gets his buddies together. He goes, what do you think I should do? And they say, we think that your finger on their back should be like a thigh. Just let them have it. Man, you're in charge now. And he followed their advice, and the kingdom split in two. He lost all control, all authority, all power. Lost his ability. And the results were disastrous. The best ruler is tough-minded and gentle-hearted, and he'll put the right people on the right horse. But what about when you work for a fool who promotes his family and his buddies, and they're all fools? And you're working hard and serving the Lord, and they get on you, and you just like, all right, forget it. What does the Lord say? Conciliation for frustration. I can't begin to tell you how many people have come in and said, you know, I need some help. What's wrong? I quit my job. Why? The Lord told me to. Did he? Did he also tell you to get another one? Oh, too bad. I thought he would. And they come in they've blown their stack. They're angry, you know. The willingness to hand in your resignation is not wise. You're going to lose your job and your income. Maybe your head if it's in this society. It's foolish to respond to foolish anger with more of the same. Be wise. There's an old Chinese proverb, outside noisy, inside empty. Don't make too much noise. So the wise seek conciliation, which will pacify their great offense. A soft answer turns away what? Wrath. But a harsh answer stirs up anger. As messengers of death, so is the wrath of the king, but a wise man will seek to appease it. Proverbs 25, by forbearance a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue can even break a bone. A wise person will diffuse anger, not inflame it. And so Solomon takes the picture that he sees again and again in the world of fools ruling over the wise. Now the reaction of the wise. David wrote in Psalm 39, I will guard my ways, and lest I would sin with my tongue. I'll restrain my mouth with the muzzle while the wicked are before me. And so I was mute with silence. I held my peace even from good. My sorrow was stirred up, my heart hot within me. While musing, the fire burned, and so I had to speak with my tongue. He tried to keep it in, and then it all came out. And the very next verse says, the minute he spoke, he was sorry he did. I should have just let the Lord work this out. I gave them a piece of my mind which I really could not afford to give up. Solomon says that's not wise. The fools, they rule, they promote, they're foolish, but the wise respond differently. I've read several books about Winston Churchill over the years, and I like Winston Churchill. He was a guy that was witty, but always got angry fast. But he was witty when he got angry. And there was a woman named Lady Astor who was in Parliament at the time that just didn't like him very well. And over a couple of years, they learned to just hate each other, but they hated each other publicly. So whenever they could embarrass one another publicly at public functions or in the press and all, they would do it. And there was a time in Parliament that Churchill records where she stood up and speaking against some of his policies, she said, "Sir, if you were my husband, I would put arsenic in your tea." And without even batting an eye, he said, "Ma'am, if you were my wife, I'd drink it." He was a quick guy, wasn't he? We like getting even. Leaving a party one time, a bit drunk from drinking too much, they walked out into the public eye and she said loudly, "Winston, you are drunk." And he replied, "Bessie, you're ugly. And in the morning I'll be sober." That's getting even, isn't it? We laugh because we like that better. Give it to him, Winston. But then you get to this word conciliation. The Greek word is katalage. It says this in the Bible, you were reconciled to Christ. It means to change hostility into friendship, enemies into friends. And then here the wise man to the foolish ruler, and who in his own incompetence and bluster has raised the ire of others. You just be reconciled. Be reconciled. It'll overcome great foolishness and offense. Finally, verse 8, the foolish laborer as opposed to the wise worker. Verse 8, he who digs a pit will fall into it. If you break through a wall, you'll be bitten by a serpent. If you quarry not bitten by a servant, by a serpent. It's early yet. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them. He who splits wood can be endangered by it. And if the axe is dull and one doesn't sharpen the edge, then he has to use more strength. But, contrast, wisdom brings success. Now, again, here are great examples of Hebrew poetry, because our work is often associated with who we are. I don't know if you've noticed people that you've never known before, you're introduced to somebody, people will invariably say, "What's your name?" And then secondly, "What do you do?" Somehow that has a lot to do with you. Well, Solomon uses that example to portray for us the success of those who are wise and the certain defeat and overthrow of those who are foolish. And again, spiritually applied. Now here are certain folks who in verse 7, 8, and 9, and 10 work foolishly, and they fail in their work, or they're damaged by their work because they don't take necessary precautions to accomplish their work successfully. If you dig a hole and then turn around and run right into it, you've forgotten. You're not wise. You should maybe put something over it Bink. Really? Good move. Or the fellow that takes down the brick wall, where the snakes hide and get cool, and you're picking them up, and you're not aware of the fact that that's what you're facing. Or you're cutting quarry stones and you're chiseling them out, and you don't put on some protective gear because those things go flying in every direction. Same thing with chopping some wood. You got to be careful. You got to prepare, if you will, for the work. Or even if you're just going to work with a dull axe, man, you're gonna have to work harder. You're gonna have to put sweat equity in. It would be smarter just to sharpen the axe. But it's unprepared. There's no circumspectness in the life of the fool. He lives his life without planning, without purpose, without anticipation, without looking ahead. He just, I'm just going to go, and then I'm going to go, oh, that's going to be it. I got one in the head. No planning. But wisdom brings success. In every one of the cases, the risk and the danger and the failure are brought about by the presumption and the lack of preparation. So what does the wise man do? He seeks the Lord. He walks with him. He makes good choices. He doesn't run ahead. He lets God lead him and God's word steer him, and he commits himself to it so that the dangers of the worldly ways are not going to come to his door. He's going to succeed because he's going to look around. God, what would you do? What would you have me to do? In other words, don't live haphazardly. Plan ahead. Think it through. Consider the angles. There are some people who live their lives, they shoot all their arrows out, and wherever they land, they go paint bullseyes. This is exactly where I wanted to be. It's crazy. Go to Nehemiah chapter 2, a man who called by God to build a wall in a city 800 miles away, and he worked for a king who wouldn't let him go, and for 4 months he prays, oh God, open a door. But during those 4 months he wrote down everything he would need. If the Lord would open the door, here's the things I'm going to need, the things I'm going to say, the things I'm going to do, the things I'm going to require, the things I'm going to bring along. And by the time the Lord opened the door and he said, well, what do you need? Nehemiah said, glad you asked, here's the book. He prepared himself. It's a good word, prepared. But all work done with negligence brings harm, and more work, while wisdom brings success. So pray and seek the Lord. Don't work harder, work smarter. See if God is blessing. If not, get on to something else, Don't be in a rush. Plan and pray. Move with determination, because the fool just walks through life, and one day he dies, and it's too late. The wise man realizes this life is short, and he lives accordingly. Let me tell you one last story before I go, because I just thought of it. There was a photographer who was sent by his magazine to cover a forest fire, and by the time he got there, he said, man, these pictures are going to be horrible. Smoke everywhere. He said, I need a plane. Do you have access? Can we get to an airport? And the fellow said, there's an airport 10 miles down the road, a rural airport. I'll call ahead. There'll be a guy waiting for you. Take you up, take some pictures. Get them to me for this evening's edition. Oh, you got it. So he quick drove over to the airport, and there was the plane parked on the runway, the pilot standing outside, and he ran over to him, and he yelled, hey, let's go, and he threw his camera stuff in the back, and he strapped in, and they took off, and the cameraman said to the fellow flying, now look, I want you to head north immediately and take 2 or 3 low passes over the fire, and I'll get the pictures I need. He said, why would I do that? He said, because I'm a photographer, and that's why I've come here. He said, so you're not the flight instructor? I like this story. Look, to live your life without considering God's input is to risk life and limb and eternity. You are not assured of a good landing without God. So make sure he's on board. Be wise. Don't be a fool. Father, thank you this morning as we sit together for the wonderful illustrations that Solomon gives to us in the Hebrew poetic sense, so that we might consider and hear and learn that there are certainly foolish things that are found in the world, not the least of which is that people think they can make it alone, that somehow you sent your son as an option of 3 or 4 options. He's one possibility, rather than he's the only name given among men whereby we can be saved. And Lord, that none of us would be those foolish folks who would think that we can get along either in this life or in the one to come without you. That God, you would bring us to our knees, that you would show us who you are, that we would surrender our wills and ways to your own. And we would be wise, not fools. And this morning, if you've been living a foolish life, come and pray with one of the men up front this morning so that you might be wise as you surrender your heart to Jesus and ask him to be the Lord of your life and ask him to fly the plane. You'll sit with him. It's for him to drive the car. You'll get in back. You're going with him. And you're going to consider his word and his ways so that wisdom will bring success, whereas foolishness, even when it's in power, is not going to last. Be wise. Know God. Use his word. Take advantage of his spirit. Teach me, Lord. Lead me, God. I pray. And he will, as you ask. Shall we stand?